Hello, this is National Chess Master Rats at ICC, here analyzing gameplay between rgadoury and Arconia. This was played in Team 4545 League in Team Event 58 in the first round of the playoffs, and it was the one that was elected as Game of the Week. So let's have a look and see what we see. Okay, so far it's just an English opening. Not much is going on. There's all kinds of ways to play this. Here, by black playing e6, black should be committing to get d5 in, and black doesn't do that. This here is what we call the Botvinnik formation. It's characterized in the English opening and maybe others. Black will put the pawn on, or white will put his pawn on d3. The knight will go to c3, the knight to e2, f4, castles. White will try to redeploy his forces to the king side and get some kind of king side attack going. Black's trump in this position is the control of the d4 square, although it's not as profound as it is in a lot of the other Botvinnik systems, which should lead to equality, because black has committed the bishop to the e7, f8 a3 diagonal. If white shows his Botvinnik hand earlier before black does this, black can get g6 in rather than e6 and bring the bishop to g7 and have further control over d4. Also, one drawback with the pawn on e6 for controlling d4 is it gets in the way of this knight on g8. Now, how do you say gets in the way of the knight? Well, you want the knight on e6 so you can further control d4, and it's done by the maneuver knight f6, knight e8, knight c7, and knight e6. But if black is to push on with e5 to do this, he in turn hands white the d5 square. Complex, huh? Really quite simple. Just a matter of maneuvering your pieces to take control of critical square. Okay, but black doesn't play for d5. I think it probably would have been good if white does wholesale exchange. Wait, not yet. I'm sorry. Okay. Next move. Okay, now black can play d5. Okay, d5. Now, if white does wholesale exchanges, he's just going to leave himself with an isolated pawn back here. Of course, white can push here, but now the game becomes very, very even. Both sides haven't castled, and this could take place one move later. The pawn structure becomes very symmetrical, but black should be okay with that. Black's trying to equalize the opening, and white's trying to get some kind of advantage with his first move. But here, the advantage is pretty much all but disappeared. So let's look at d5 next move when it was playable. It was playable here. How's white going to react to this? He could play d3. Black may decide to play d4, locking up the center, and then possibly coming in with e5 next, and it takes on a lot of characteristics of a reverse Benoni. White will be playing for f4. It becomes a whole new kind of game. But this didn't happen. I don't think there's anything pretty much wrong with how black played this. But now d5's out of the question because white has 4 attackers on the square. 2 pawns, a knight, and a bishop, and black doesn't have enough resources. He would have to give up a pawn, and I don't think there's enough there. Now, a6 is okay. It's thematic. The idea is to place the queen on c7 where she won't be bothered, and at the same time to try to get a b5 break in. And white could play for d4 here and go into a Rc8 type position if pawn takes, the knight takes, and black will still employ some of the strategies I've shown with the arrows, trying to get b5 in and eventually d5. That's the way you break out of the Rc8. But these things don't happen. Black chooses to occupy the d4 square right now. I don't think that's quite right because it's just a little early. But let's just stop and take a look. Look at the back ranks. Dead match. Okay? Kings, rooks, bishops, knights, queen. Dead match. The rest of the board from the second rank up, both sides have moved 3 minor pieces into play, but white has 1 extra pawn move. So suddenly black's well, I wouldn't say he's a half tempo ahead. He could develop the queen here, and it looks like he's a tempo ahead, but he isn't really, because black needs time to unleash this bishop. But a good move would be, a solid move would be something like d6. Well, queen c7, nothing wrong with that, a waiting move. Maybe rook b8, trying to induce bishop f4, where this bishop may become a target later. The idea is to try to get a b5 break in at some point. Kind of follow this strategy. But putting the knight on d4, it allows this exchange. And the drawback is black no longer has the square at his disposal. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that black can't use. But then I think white was in position to rid himself of it. But white never chose to do that. Here he had a chance to play d4, and he chose d3. So white would lose the tempo going to d4. And usually when somebody does that, even though d4 would still be an okay move, white's not likely to play it psychologically because he's already put his pawn on d3. Make sense? Now, sometimes people won't do things that they should. It loses a tempo, but putting the pawn on d4 is still a good plan for white. But this stops it all right there, and the rest is conjecture. Once again, the game is still pretty level. The back ranks are still a dead match. And now black in turn has spent a tempo. He's anchored in his pawn. Now, I don't think this move makes any sense for white. G4 is not a square black really wants to use. Okay, a lot of times h3 is played to keep the bishop on e3 from being bothered, but the bishop's not going to e3. So let's take a look at the time. How long did white spend on it? Well, his clock went down a minute and a half, so he spent close to 2 minutes on it. But what white really needs to do is develop a piece. Okay, white could even opt for f4 here. Maybe white wants to do this, but doesn't like this knight eyeballing the e3 square. Well, he should be okay out of that. Okay, let's let knight g4 come in. Okay, now let's just take the pawn. Okay, now if white brings this knight in, I'll take it off. And that pawn becomes a target on e3. d4, black doesn't have enough compensation for the pawn here. But so f4 would have been playable and didn't need to fear knight g4, but we'll go with h3. And black immediately strikes with b5, didn't have to prepare it. That's one advantage of getting rid of that knight on c3. And I think this helps black a little bit. Even though black has an isolated pawn, suddenly black's got some open lines, over here on the queen side. Black's got some activity. Let's take a look and see how that works out. Okay, bishop d2, got that developed. But white's not following through with the idea of f4, which seemed to be why he played h3. Black just develops. Now white wants to move his queen rook, but he doesn't want to drop his pawn, so he covers it. Could white have played queen b3 instead? Well, maybe he doesn't want the queen on that square. Maybe he was trying to get the queen this way. But queen b3 seems reasonable. It attacks a pawn for what it's worth, and it gets it on a decent diagonal. But a3 gives black an eventual break with b4. And black instead chooses to strike in the center. And this is a pretty good move, actually. One of the things they say how to meet a wing attack, although white's not attacking on the wing, but how to meet action on the wing is to play in the center. And this in turn is going to open up some lines. And f3 seems wrong because it's reducing the mobility of this bishop. Now these light square bishops do eventually get traded off. It's almost remarkable how that happens, but it does. You'd think that line was locked up. But let's see. Let's take a look at this instead. Now, how's black going to retake? Well, let's take with the bishop first. Okay. Now let's bring the queen in, not the knight. The reason I'm putting the queen in is because it centralizes the queen on a great square. Now, white doesn't seem to have a whole lot of activity here. The queen doesn't really have any scope along this diagonal, and even c2 is just going to run it into a tempo. f4, the problem with a potential f4 move is that suddenly this white king side is getting kind of weak, and black can just ignore this and start improving the position of his pieces. So it just kind of shows how this d5 move was great for black. Great for white. I'm sorry, great for black. So maybe f3 is needed just to try to stay solid here. Okay. Now the h6 move, I don't think that's the best move because it does weaken the king side ever slightly. We're not trying to keep white out of the square, but let's move on. Okay, there's the idea of maneuvering the knight. Okay, maybe black would like to trade off the dark squared bishops, figuring this is a bad bishop to leave white with. Okay, moving on. Now comes the f4 counter. Now, black doesn't opts to imprison his bishop instead of trying to trade it off, but he couldn't necessarily. Let's see. Pawn takes. Both sides aren't completely developed. The back ranks are almost still a complete match, except the white kings that advanced. f6 isn't all that bad. The drawback with f5 is that eventually that pawn chain is going to get dissipated, and here it goes. Eventually is now. Even though white's getting rid of his bad bishop, black gets a protected pass pawn. So I kind of like black here. Now the knight gets into play. White chops it off. Now I think it would have been better to take with the h pawn. The f6, I don't think black really needs that f6 square too much. But here black makes a mistake. This lets this knight return into play. This knight was bamboozled. It wants to get to c3, right? And it can't. So 22 moves in. They haven't spent a whole lot of time on this. Just complete the development. Get the queen over here, and get ready to play b5, b4. Get the rooks on some open lines. See, white's has really no attack here on the king side. The king side is now locked up. Black has all the fun here. So d3 was just a little premature. Now this knight is going to get into play in a moment. And here it comes. And now the knight has a wonderful square that it can't be evicted from. So, and this pawn, black's trump in the position, is going to be gone. Now white makes another mistake here. Why get rid of that great knight? That knight was dominating the white position. You still can win the pawn if you want, but now the queen's on open file. It can be tempoed. The knight's no longer there to shield it, and there it comes. Queen backs up. Get ready to double the rook somewhere. Opposes. Now that may not be wise to do that. Why not double your rooks? Get control of the open file. You're down a pawn, but let's see. White doesn't have time to grab this right away because d1 is falling. So let's. Whoops. What's going wrong here? Oh, I stopped at d5. Come on, back up. It's not letting me play the moves I wanted to play. There we go. Okay, we're going to give up the pawn. But here, black gets an awful lot of pressure in the white position. Obviously, the king can't come up. Rook d3 is fatal, so let's come back. And if anything, you can check again, followed by putting the rook down here, and black's very close to having a winning game. Very close. And not to mention the fact this pawn could be threatened with check. White just doesn't have enough here to defend, I don't think. Let's see, Queen F1. E4 is going to fall. Oh my goodness, this is just turning into a rout. Black is getting his way. Okay, let's back up. Because this trades off, in effect, by taking on D1, it trades off an active rook for a passive rook. And now black gets his B5 break in. White says, I want to pass pawn. And penetrates with the queen. The white king's in a little bit of danger here. And black had a threat on C2. And here black kind of went into panic mode. Probably sees this pawn pushing on and doesn't like it, but black's okay here. Just rook C2. White doesn't have time to push F7 because you're going to take this off. And you can even take it with the queen. That might be better because now on takes and takes with check, and then the rook will come back and stop this pawn. So the game would still be even after rook C2. The best I think white can get out of this is probably a perpetual check. Got to be careful. Let's see. We have see, the problem is this rook's pinned. He can't bring that rook into play. I think white will get a perpetual check out of this. And that's about the best white can do. But instead, what black plays is it just allows white to penetrate into this position. Now there's a big problem here. Queen G7 could be played soon, and that's the only move to stop it. And now comes this check. Now black's in trouble. Dropping a rook. He didn't even have to take the rook. There might be a perpetual, but check here is adequate. And black must interpose, and now comes another deadly check. And there's nothing black can do. If king F8, queen F7 is mate. If king H8, it looks like this rook sacrifice is deadly. There may be more than one way to win it, but that does it. Anyways, a nice combination in the end. Just one little mistake for black. Let's go back and look and see how long black took on G6. I forgot to mention that. Okay, F6. Let's see. First off, white spent a good 4 minutes on it. And black spent about nearly just over 2 minutes. Had plenty of time on the clock, not as much as white, but that was this G6 proved to be the losing move. Black was okay. Anyway, congratulations to white. Well played game by both sides for the most part. Much better than the ratings might indicate. And I thank everyone so much for their time.